Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we follow the keen eyes of Miss Marple, a brilliant mind with a knack for uncovering secrets as she confronts a perplexing disappearance in a quiet English village. A footman has vanished without a trace. Whispers of a hidden passage stir through the manor, and old loyalties are tested. What truths lie behind the polished doors? The village of Little Bramble prided itself on being precisely the sort of place one might imagine on a postcard, roses blooming in cottage gardens, lace curtains fluttering in the windows, and gossip winding its way more swiftly than the postman's bicycle. That afternoon, the manor house lawns were at their finest, dotted with tables for the annual summer fete. Cakes, trifles, and cucumber sandwiches lay temptingly beside bowls of strawberries. The brass band, slightly off-key but earnest, played Rule Britannia with gusto. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a pale lilac dress and a straw hat adorned with a modest ribbon, was seated quietly near the rose arch. She smiled benignly at the bustle, but, true to form, her sharp blue eyes missed very little. She had observed, for instance, that Mrs. Ellery's sponge cake, though praised by everyone, had a suspiciously even texture that suggested the interference of a certain baker in the High Street. Equally, she had noticed that young Peter Chalmers slipped more than one chocolate eclair into his pocket when he thought no one was looking. It was precisely this air of gentle observance, half invisible to those around her, that later would prove invaluable. But for the moment, the fete carried on with its ribbons and merriment, a perfect English afternoon. At the heart of the proceedings stood Lady Agnes Harrowden, the hostess. She had a regal presence that made her seem taller than she truly was, her dark hair streaked dramatically with silver. She was in the middle of making introductions, clasping hands, offering perfunctory smiles when the murmured arrival of Lord Harrowden's new footman drew eyes from the crowd. Tall, striking, and curiously nervous, the young man seemed out of place in his crisp livery. Some remarked that Lady Agnes had insisted on new staff after the old butler retired, and others whispered of her fondness for modern appearances. The newcomer's name, they said, was Charles. Miss Marple took him in with a single glance, the too tight collar, the slightly unpolished shoes, and the way his eyes darted to the side whenever spoken to. She thought it was hardly her place that he looked more like a man running from something than one entering service. By late afternoon, the band had given way to a more subdued hum of conversation. The villagers drifted between the tea tent and the flower competition, their voices mixing with the rustle of leaves. It was then that a curious thing occurred. Charles was seen crossing the lawn toward the stables with a tray of empty glasses. Several villagers noted it, though not with any great interest. He was expected to return. Yet time passed, and the glasses remained uncollected. Lady Agnes grew increasingly impatient, her thin brows drawn into a frown. When at last a maid was dispatched to the stables, she returned pale and flustered, whispering something into Lady Agnes's ear that made her clutch the arm of her chair. The tray had been found leaning against the wall, the glasses neatly stacked, but there was no sign of the footman. The air of festivity faltered. Someone joked too loudly that perhaps he had gone off to flirt with a village girl. Others suggested he'd grown faint and gone to lie down. Yet even as explanations floated, unease began to ripple. Servants did not simply vanish in Little Bramble. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely in her lap. She noticed how Lady Agnes's fingers trembled as she adjusted her pearls, and how the maid avoided everyone's gaze as though frightened of speaking further. Most curious of all was the silence of Mr. Lionel Trent, Lady Agnes's solicitor, who had been chatting easily all afternoon but now stood brooding by the edge of the lawn. The fete continued outwardly. No hostess would allow panic to spoil her event, but the laughter had grown brittle, the conversations forced. By twilight, the villagers dispersed with more questions than they had brought, their voices carrying down the lanes. Strange, wasn't it, the way he disappeared? Mark my words, there's more to it. Well, Lady Agnes wouldn't want a scandal. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her parasol tapping lightly against the cobbles. To the casual eye, she seemed merely tired from the day's excitement. But within her mind, threads were already weaving themselves into a pattern. Human nature, she knew, never failed to reveal itself, and the Vanishing Footman was, she suspected, the start of a tale far darker than a spoiled fate. The morning after the fate dawned with a pale, uncertain light, the sort that promised neither rain nor shine. In Little Bramble, the mood seemed curiously subdued, as though the entire village had woken with the same half-formed thought pressing against their minds the matter of the vanished footman. At the greengrocer's, at the post office, in the little tea-shop on the high street, tongues wagged with a vigor that only the hint of scandal could rouse. Mrs. Ellery was the first to speak of it openly. She stood at the counter of Mr. Prowse's shop, her basket already laden with carrots and onions, and leaned across conspiratorially. "Mark my words, Arthur," she said to the grocer. "It's not natural for a man to walk out in the middle of his duties and never come back. There's something more to it." Mr. Prowse, always cautious in his judgments, merely grunted. But as soon as she had left, he repeated the story to Mrs. Larkin, who repeated it to Mr. Chalmers, and thus the tale took wing. At the vicarage, Reverend Green listened with an expression of pained concern as his housekeeper recounted the details she had gleaned. "Gone, Reverend, as if the ground had swallowed him. And they say Lady Agnes wouldn't let anyone call the police until late in the evening. Imagine!" The Reverend frowned. He disliked gossip, but could not deny that the affair troubled him. In a village as small as Little Bramble, disappearances were unheard of. At her own neat cottage on the edge of the green, Miss Marple received a visit from Mrs. Bantry, her old friend and frequent companion. "It's most extraordinary," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, settling herself into a chintz-covered chair with the air of someone about to deliver important intelligence. "They say the poor fellow had enemies, debts, perhaps, or else he was not at all the man he pretended to be." She lowered her voice, though there was no one but Miss Marple to hear. "And between you and me, Jane," Lady Agnes seemed frightfully put out. "More than one would expect over a mere servant." Miss Marple poured the tea with her usual composure. "People often reveal more in what they do not say than in what they do," she remarked softly. "I wonder whether Lady Agnes was distressed about the young manor for herself." Mrs. Bantry blinked at her friend's calm tone, but she was used to such observations. Miss Marple had a way of uttering them as though they were nothing more than idle thoughts. Yet, as Mrs. Bantry well knew, they seldom proved unimportant. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves of the County Constabulary arrived at the manor house. He was a solid, unimaginative man, the sort the villagers trusted implicitly, though Miss Marple had once observed that his conclusions tended to follow the most obvious path. Lady Agnes greeted him with cool courtesy. She described Charles's arrival only a fortnight earlier. His excellent references, his willingness to work, and his strange, sudden disappearance. "He was there one moment, Inspector, and gone the next. I cannot account for it." Graves frowned. "You are certain he had no family connections? No acquaintances in the village?" "None that I am aware of." Lady Agnes's tone held a faint edge. "I prefer my staff to be entirely devoted to their duties." The inspector walked the grounds with a constable, noting the neatly stacked glasses in the stable, the absence of footprints in the soft earth, and the utter lack of any trail. It was as though Charles had vanished into thin air. That evening he returned to the station and declared it a case of desertion. "Young men do it often enough," he told his sergeant. "Fickle creatures, ready to run at the first sign of hardship. He'll turn up in London, no doubt, squandering his wages." The sergeant nodded dutifully, but within the village the explanation failed to convince. "Desertion, indeed," cried Mrs. Larkin, thumping her umbrella on the cobbles. "And leaving his wages behind him? Not likely." Miss Marple listened to it all with quiet attention. She heard the theories that Charles had been a thief who'd run off with valuables. That he'd been in some dreadful scrape and fled before it caught up with him, even that he had been spirited away by gypsies who sometimes camped on the outskirts of the village. Each explanation bore the flavor of its teller's prejudices. Miss Marple considered them all but kept her own counsel. On the third day after the fete, a new rumor arose, and this one carried more weight. Mr. Lionel Trent, Lady Agnes's solicitor, was seen walking with her in the gardens, their voices raised in sharp dispute. The gardener swore he heard Lady Agnes say, "You promised me this would never come to light." The words spread like wildfire, repeated with embellishments until half the village believed Lady Agnes was concealing some dark secret. At the same time, another piece of information surfaced. The maid who had found the empty tray confided to her cousin that she had noticed a slip of paper beneath the glasses, though Lady Agnes had snatched it away before anyone else could see. What was written on that paper? No one knew, but speculation flourished. Some said it was a letter of blackmail. Others insisted it was proof of the young man's true identity. Inspector Graves, when confronted with these rumors, merely sighed. Nonsense. Idle tales. But Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, considered it differently. She had seen too many examples of human frailty to dismiss whispers entirely. Often, she reflected, what seemed like idle gossip contained a kernel of truth, though distorted by retelling. She remembered Charles' face clearly, the darting eyes, the strained manner, the way he had carried himself with a mixture of pride and fear. It reminded her, faintly, of a young man from her own youth who had stolen from his employer to pay for a girl's passage to America. Everyone had believed him shiftless and unreliable, but the truth had been altogether more tragic. Human motives were rarely simple, Miss Marple mused. As the week wore on, Little Bramble became a hive of speculation. Conversations began and ended with the missing footman. At the Women's Institute, the ladies discussed whether they ought to send flowers to Lady Agnes as a gesture of sympathy, though half suspected she wanted no such intrusion. At the pub, men argued whether Charles had met with foul play or merely tired of service, and through it all, Miss Marple observed with quiet patience. One afternoon, she encountered Inspector Graves himself outside the post office. He tipped his hat politely, and she inquired after his progress. "Nothing to report, Miss Marple," he said brusquely. "The young man will be found eventually, or not. Either way, there is no evidence of a crime." "No evidence?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That does not always mean no crime, Inspector. Sometimes the absence of evidence is itself significant." Graves gave a short laugh, thinking it a harmless quip from an elderly lady. But Miss Marple's eyes remained steady, their gaze fixed on some puzzle only she could see. For her, the disappearance of Charles was no random event. It had threads leading somewhere, threads she meant to follow, however delicate they might appear. By evening, another ripple spread through the village. Lionel Trent had been seen leaving the manor house in a hurry, his expression grim, his papers clutched in disarray. Something, clearly, was brewing behind the elegant facade of Lady Agnes's household. And in the midst of it all, Miss Marple knitted calmly by her fire, her needles clicking softly. To anyone else, she seemed merely passing the time. But to those who knew her well, there was a glimmer in her eyes that suggested she had already discerned the first faint outlines of the truth. The disappearance of the footman was no accident, and Little Bramble, with its roses and gossip, was about to reveal secrets long buried beneath its tranquil surface. The matter of Charles's disappearance might have been left to wither into village legend, like a curious story told beside the fire on winter nights, had not Inspector Graves received an unexpected telephone call on the Thursday following the fete. The call came from Lady Agnes herself, her voice taut and controlled. She requested his presence at the manor house with an urgency that was difficult to ignore. And though Graves had been content to label the matter desertion, The tone of Lady Agnes's request made him feel obliged to take another look. By midday, he arrived at the great stone building. The manor, though handsome and ancient, held a slight air of melancholy that day. Its windows stared like solemn eyes, its ivy-clad walls brooding under a low sky. Lady Agnes met him in the drawing-room, where she stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly. She appeared paler than before, her composure brittle. "There has been a development," she announced without preamble. "My maid found this near the stables." She extended a folded handkerchief. Inside, Graves discovered a torn scrap of paper, browned with dirt and slightly crumpled. The words written in a bold, hurried hand were just legible. "You cannot hide forever. I shall speak unless the remainder was lost." The paper ripped through the final phrase. Graves frowned. Where exactly was this found? In the corner by the hay bales, Lady Agnes replied, her voice taut. It could easily have been overlooked. "I cannot think what it means, unless perhaps the young man was involved in something unsavory." Graves tucked the fragment into an envelope with professional gravity. "This may alter things. If Charles received such a note, it could explain his disappearance. Someone may have threatened him." Lady Agnes nodded but offered no more. Her gaze shifted to the window where the gardens stretched out in manicured perfection. For a moment, she seemed entirely absorbed in her own thoughts, as though calculating risks invisible to the inspector. Outside, in the rose garden, Miss Marple strolled slowly, her parasol looped neatly over one arm. She had come, ostensibly, to deliver some lavender sachets for the housekeeper, a thoughtful gift, though perhaps less innocent than it appeared. For Miss Marple never delivered anything without collecting something in return. Today, she collected impressions of the stiffness in Lady Agnes's bearing, the way Lionel Trent passed by with his briefcase pressed tightly against him, and the anxious flurry of servants whispering when they thought themselves unobserved. When Inspector Graves emerged, he encountered Miss Marple at the garden gate. He tipped his hat. "Good day, madam. Still taking an interest in this business, I see." "One takes an interest in people," Inspector Miss Marple replied gently. "And people are seldom as they appear. You have discovered something, perhaps." Graves hesitated, but the old lady's expression was so mild that he allowed himself to be candid. "A note of sorts. Threatening, one might say. Could be blackmail. I'll not speculate further until we have more facts." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Ah, blackmail. A most pernicious weed in the garden of human behavior. It flourishes in the darkest corners." She tapped her parasol thoughtfully. "It so often happens that what seems hidden to the world is perfectly obvious to those nearby." The inspector, somewhat baffled, muttered a polite farewell and returned to his car. Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She had seen too much of life to dismiss that note as a mere curiosity. Blackmail always led to trouble. Always. That evening the village hummed with renewed speculation. At the pub over pints of ale, men speculated whether Charles had been blackmailed for gambling debts. At the Women's Institute, the ladies wondered if he had concealed a scandalous romance. Every theory grew more extravagant as it passed from mouth to mouth. But beneath the noise, subtle changes were occurring. Lionel Trent was seen less often at the tea shop, and when he did appear, his eyes darted nervously as though he expected to be questioned. The maid who had discovered the note grew quieter, reluctant to speak even to her friends, and Lady Agnes herself, though outwardly composed, was glimpsed pacing her drawing-room late into the night, her figure lit in silhouette against the tall windows. Miss Marple, meanwhile, undertook her own gentle inquiries. She had a talent for making herself invisible, for asking questions that seemed no more than kindly interesting. At Mrs. Larkin's shop, she remarked upon the scarcity of certain goods, which led Mrs. Larkin, ever one to resist a confidant, into a rambling account of the footman's visits. He came in twice for tobacco, though he always looked as if he didn't quite know how to ask for it. And once, she added significantly, he bought a sheet of writing paper and an envelope. Strange for a servant, don't you think? Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. A letter written, perhaps, or an attempt at one. She wondered who might have received it, or whether it had been delivered at all. The following afternoon, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry in the latter's drawing-room, sipping weak tea. "The inspector thinks it blackmail," Mrs. Bantry whispered, leaning close, "and I dare say he's right. Why, I've heard whispers that Lady Agnes's late husband had dealings that were never quite respectable. Investments abroad or some such. Perhaps the young man knew something." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she knitted. "One must be careful not to accept appearances, Dolly. A whisper can travel faster than a fact, and twice as far. Still, if Charles was blackmailing or being blackmailed, it tells us something about his connections." Mrs. Bantry pursed her lips. "You mean he wasn't what he seemed?" "No one ever is, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "The question is, what did he seem, and to whom?" Meanwhile, Inspector Graves pursued the official route. He made inquiries in nearby towns, circulated Charles' description, and requested information from London agencies. The responses were slow and unhelpful. No record of a Charles in Lady Agnes's employ prior to his sudden arrival. No trail of family, no trace in parish registers. It was as though the young man had sprung into existence the moment he appeared at the manor house. By Sunday, a week after the fete, tensions in Little Bramble had reached a delicate pitch. The villagers wanted answers, but none were forthcoming. The fete's gaiety seemed distant now, replaced by an air of unease. Even the weather turned unsettled, with sudden showers and gusts of wind rattling the hedgerows, as though nature itself conspired to deepen the sense of disquiet. On that same Sunday evening, a curious incident occurred. The vicar, returning from evensong, thought he saw a figure slipping through the shadows near the manor's gate. He described it as tall, slim, and moving with haste. But when he called out, the figure vanished into the trees. He reported it the next morning, though Inspector Graves dismissed it as a trick of the twilight. Miss Marple, however, listened with sharp attention. Tall, slim, moving hastily, she could not help but recall Charles. If the footman had returned in secret, the question was why? Why creep in shadows rather than walk openly? Unless, of course, he had reason to fear discovery. Miss Marple pondered the matter as she sat in her little parlour, her knitting in her lap. The strands of the puzzle were tightening, though still incomplete. There was the vanished servant, the torn note, the silence of Lady Agnes, the anxiety of her solicitor. She thought of gardens and weeds, of roses cultivated to perfection, and the secrets that lay tangled in their roots. Human nature, she reminded herself, was always the same whether in a quiet village or a bustling city. Pride, fear, ambition, jealousy were the threads that bound people's actions, and somewhere among them lay the truth of Charles's disappearance. For the moment, Miss Marple said nothing. She preferred to wait, to listen, to observe. Others might rush to judgment, but she knew the truth would reveal itself in time. It always did, once one had the patience to watch and the wisdom to understand the smallest of details. And so the early investigation continued, official and unofficial, each step leading the village further into shadows it had not yet imagined. What had begun as a missing footman was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was, in truth, the beginning of something much darker, something that would test even Miss Marple's quiet genius. The uneasy quiet that had settled over Little Bramble after the fete could not last forever. People needed conclusions, even if they were the wrong ones, and Inspector Graves, under pressure from both his superiors and the increasingly impatient whispers of the villagers, declared at last that the matter must move forward. A suspect, he reasoned, must be found. By Monday, word had spread that suspicion had fallen upon Lionel Trent, Lady Agnes's solicitor. It seemed almost inevitable. Trent had been seen in loud dispute with Lady Agnes. He was observed leaving the manor in a state of visible agitation, and his association with the household placed him in close proximity to the vanished footman. More importantly, he had no firm alibi for the afternoon of the fete. The inspector, satisfied with the accumulation of circumstantial evidence, announced quietly to his sergeant that they would be keeping a very close eye on Mr. Trent. The village seized upon this with relish. Mrs. Larkin, relaying the latest tidbit across her counter, declared, "I always said there was something shifty about that one. Solicitors know too much of other people's business." At the post office, speculation mounted that Trent had been hiding documents, perhaps related to Lady Agnes's estate, and that Charles had discovered them. "He'd silence the boy, wouldn't he?" said Mr. Chalmers grimly. "A fellow like that wouldn't think twice." Lionel Trent himself appeared increasingly haggard. Once neat and composed, he now looked worn, his collar askew, his hair untidy. He avoided the high street whenever possible, and when he did appear, he offered curt nods instead of conversation. To many, his silence was proof of guilt. Only Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, saw something different. Not guilt, but fear, and not of the law. Fear, she reflected, was a far more complex thing than villagers like to imagine. Inspector Graves paid Trent a visit at his office in the small square adjoining the church. The solicitor received him stiffly, standing behind his desk as though to defend himself with the weight of his papers. "This line of inquiry is absurd, Inspector," he protested. "Yes, I had words with Lady Agnes, but they were of a strictly professional nature. Matters of estate management are often heated. That is no proof of wrongdoing." Graves eyed him steadily. "It is more than heated words, Mr. Trent. Several witnesses say you appeared most agitated, and we know you were among the last to see the footman. Can you account for your movements after the fete?" "I went home," Trent replied shortly. "I have no one to corroborate it, if that is your meaning. But I assure you, Inspector, I had no quarrel with the boy." Graves remained unconvinced, but lacking direct evidence. He could only watch. Yet his watchful presence was enough to colour the villagers' opinion, and by the week's end, most residents regarded Trent as the likely culprit. He might not have killed the boy, some allowed, but he surely knew more than he was saying. Miss Marple, however, was not persuaded. She had watched Lionel Trent for years, his tidy habits, his punctuality at church, his cautious manner with words. He was not a man of sudden violence. His disputes with Lady Agnes might have been sharp, but his temper was more of the simmering variety than the explosive. More importantly, she noted the quality of his anxiety. It was not the defensiveness of a man caught in a lie, but the shrinking wariness of someone who feared exposure of another kind. One afternoon, Mrs. Bantry came to tea, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "It's all but certain, Jane. They say Lionel Trent has been handling Lady Agnes's affairs most improperly. Some investment schemes went wrong. The boy must have stumbled across something he should not. I dare say it explains the blackmail note." Miss Marple smiled faintly and offered her guest a scone. "It is very natural to think so, Dolly, but very often, when things seem to fit too neatly, they are not quite the truth. Real life has a way of being untidy." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "I do wish you would be less enigmatic, Jane. One would think you actually enjoy keeping people in suspense." Miss Marple merely returned to her knitting, her needles flashing softly. She recalled a case from St. Mary Mead many years before, where suspicion had fallen upon a gardener accused of poisoning his employer's roses. The entire village had been certain, but in the end it had been the employer herself, careless with her own tonic, who had caused the trouble. Appearances, Miss Marple reflected, were dangerous things. Meanwhile, Lady Agnes grew more withdrawn. Once a commanding hostess, she now rarely left the manor grounds. Visitors who glimpsed her through the windows remarked upon her distracted air, the way she paced the drawing room, pausing often to look out at the garden. She dismissed questions about Charles curtly, insisting she could not be expected to know the habits of a servant who had been with her barely a fortnight. Yet her composure, like porcelain, seemed increasingly fragile. The servants whispered more freely. The housemaid confided to a friend that she had once seen Charles in a heated conversation with Lady Agnes herself. Another insisted he had caught sight of the footman slipping a folded letter into his pocket late at night. Rumors of romance, of theft, of secret kinship between master and servant all ran wild. And through it all, Miss Marple listened, sorting the threads like skeins of yarn, discarding the weak strands and saving the ones with true strength. It was not Lionel Trent, she thought, who required the greatest scrutiny. His nerves, his evasions, his disputes, these were distractions, perhaps even deliberate ones. No, the true key lay elsewhere, in the small details that others ignored. The unpolished shoes, the too tight collar, the way Charles had seemed ill at ease in his own livery. These were not the hallmarks of a seasoned servant. They were signs of something else pretending, perhaps, to be what he was not. The official investigation, however, pressed on. Inspector Graves announced that Lionel Trent would remain the primary person of interest until further notice. Some thought an arrest was imminent. Miss Marple, for her part, simply placed another log on her fire and let her needles click steadily. She knew better than to interrupt the police in their certainties. Sooner or later, facts would emerge to shatter them, and then she would be ready. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows, Miss Marple walked home from a visit to the vicarage. The lanes were quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Halfway along, she paused. On the ground, half hidden by the verge, lay a small object, a brass button dulled by dirt. She stooped, examined it, and slipped it quietly into her reticule. It was of the kind sewn to a servant's livery. She did not speak of it to anyone. Not yet, but her eyes were thoughtful as she entered her cottage. A button, a note, a vanishing footman, and a village eager for easy conclusions. The pattern was emerging, slowly but surely. The first suspect had been chosen, but Miss Marple knew the story was far from over. And somewhere in Little Bramble, she thought, someone was growing restless. When that restlessness broke into action, more pieces of the puzzle would surely fall into place. The brass button lay on Miss Marple's small writing table, glinting faintly in the lamplight. To anyone else, it might have appeared a trifling thing hardly worth notice in the course of an ordinary walk. Buttons were lost often enough. Yet to Miss Marple, who had made a lifelong study of such trifles, it was more than a scrap of metal. It was a thread in the tapestry, waiting to be followed. She examined it carefully, turning it over between her fingers. The crest engraved upon it was that of the Harrowden household, unmistakable. And though the edges were dulled with soil, the button itself was not rusted. Recently lost, then, and not weathered by long exposure. Her eyes narrowed slightly. If Charles had vanished from the fete and his livery remained in question, then this button suggested something had occurred outside the neat explanations offered by Inspector Graves. The next morning, Miss Marple strolled into the village with her shopping basket, her steps measured and unhurried. She paused at the post office, where she inquired ever so gently about recent parcels or letters. Miss Hartwell, the postmistress, prided herself on discretion, but she could not resist confiding in Miss Marple's sympathetic ear. There was a letter, she admitted, lowering her voice. Came through just before the fete, addressed to a Charles D. at the manor house. Odd, really, since servants don't usually receive posts so quickly after being hired. Handwriting is rather bold, if you ask me. I wondered. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, though her mind raced. A letter delivered to Charles at the manor. That fit neatly with Mrs. Larkin's recollection of him buying paper and envelopes. Correspondence, then perhaps of a clandestine sort. She filed the thought away, tucking it neatly beside the brass button in her growing collection of small but telling observations. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves pushed forward with his suspicions of Lionel Trent. He interviewed the solicitor again, pressing him for explanations of his quarrel with Lady Agnes. "Financial matters," Trent replied stiffly, his hands clenched on his desk. "There is nothing unlawful, nothing that would warrant police interest. My dealings are entirely professional." Graves remained unimpressed. "Yet you seemed agitated, Mr. Trent, and agitation often conceals guilt." Trent's face flushed. "Or fear, Inspector. Fear of being falsely accused. I assure you I had no hand in the footman's disappearance." But Graves was already convinced. To his mind, the fragments fit neatly together: the quarrel, the solicitor's evasions, the maid's gossip. What he did not notice, what he could not notice, were the subtler threads: Lady Agnes's tightening composure, the nervous glances of the staff, and the peculiar inconsistency of a footman who wore livery that did not quite fit. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Bantry for a quiet supper. As they shared a simple meal of cold meats and pickled cucumbers, Miss Marple ventured a question. "Have you ever noticed, Dolly, how easily people are deceived by a uniform? One sees livery and one assumes a servant. Yet clothes, as we know, can be borrowed, altered, even stolen." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "You mean Charles wasn't truly a footman?" "I mean only that he did not wear his role with ease. His collar was too tight, his shoes unpolished." And now she glanced toward the writing table where the button lay concealed beneath a folded napkin. "There are signs that his livery may not have been entirely intact." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Jane, do you mean he was an impostor?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "We mustn't leap to conclusions. But very often, Dolly, what seems to be a disappearance may in fact be something else altogether. The question is not merely where Charles went, but who he truly was." At the manor house, Lady Agnes grew increasingly tense. Servants reported that she had locked herself in the study for long hours, and when she emerged, her expression was grim. One afternoon, the housemaid overheard her say sharply to Lionel Trent, "If you cannot contain this, we are all lost." The remark, carried swiftly through the village by whisper and repetition, deepened suspicions against the solicitor. Yet Miss Marple, hearing it relayed, thought not of Lionel, but of Lady Agnes herself. Contain what, precisely? And why such fear? On Wednesday, another small clue surfaced. The vicar, tidying the vestry, discovered a crumpled envelope pushed behind a hymn book. The address had been torn away, but faint traces of ink remained, as though someone had scribbled hastily and then discarded it. When he mentioned it to Miss Marple in passing, she asked quietly if she might see it. The envelope smelled faintly of tobacco, and there was a smudge of unfamiliar sealing wax along the flap. To the vicar, it meant nothing. To Miss Marple, it hinted of hurried concealment. Letters again, always letters. She returned home that afternoon and laid the envelope beside the button. Small, overlooked things, but each with a voice if one only listened. To Miss Marple, they whispered of identity, of secrets carried into the village beneath the guise of servitude, and she thought, with a faint sigh, of the many times she had seen young men entangled in pretense, only to be trapped by it. Deception was a dangerous garment. It seldom fit comfortably for long. By the week's end, Inspector Graves resolved to bring Lionel Trent formally before the magistrate for questioning. The news swept through Little Bramble like a storm, stirring satisfaction in some, outrage in others. Mrs. Ellery declared it a relief at last. Something is being done, while Mrs. Larkin sniffed that she had always distrusted lawyers. Yet amidst the clatter of opinions, Miss Marple remained still. She had seen the button, she had traced the letters, and she knew in her quiet heart that Lionel Trent was not the true answer. He might have his secrets, but they were of a different kind. On Saturday evening, as twilight deepened over the green, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting in her lap, and reflected on what she had learned. A vanished footman who wore his livery poorly. A letter addressed to him at the manor, despite his recent arrival. A threatening note, torn and hidden. A solicitor under suspicion, though his guilt felt misplaced. And now, a button lying in the lane as if cast off in haste. These were not random details. They were pieces of a pattern, faint but discernible to anyone who had spent a lifetime observing human folly. She thought of gardens again, how weeds revealed themselves not by grand gestures, but by tiny shoots peeping through the soil. One did not need a magnifying glass or a microscope, only the patience to notice. And Miss Marple had always possessed that patience in abundance. Somewhere in Little Bramble, she thought, the truth was quietly stirring, waiting to rise. And when it did, it would not be the neat conclusion Inspector Graves so confidently pursued. It would be something altogether more unsettling. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes half closed, the firelight dancing across her face. To all appearances, she was a gentle old lady at rest, but her mind remained sharp, threading buttons, envelopes, and notes into a fabric others could not yet see. A hidden clue had revealed itself, and she knew from long experience that it was only the beginning. The real story of the Vanishing Footman had scarcely begun to unfold. The week following the discovery of the brass button and the whispered tale of the hidden envelope brought with it a shifting of moods in Little Bramble. What had begun as speculation now fermented into sharper whispers and bolder confrontations. People were less content to sit idly by as the story of the Vanishing Footman had grown teeth, and those teeth now nipped at the villagers' own secrets. It began in the tea shop. Mrs. Larkin, unable to resist her talent for insinuation, let slip to her neighbor that she had seen Lady Agnes speaking privately with a stranger near the stables weeks before the fete. "A tall man in a dark coat," she declared over her cup. "Not local, I'm sure of it." They spoke in low tones, and when he saw me coming, he walked off briskly. And who appeared shortly after, do you think? Why, the very same footman. By the next morning, the tale had reached every ear in the village. Lady Agnes, they decided, had connections she dared not reveal. At the manor house, meanwhile, Lionel Trent bore the brunt of suspicion. The inspector's men, though not yet arresting him, appeared often at his office door. His clients began to avoid him, and whispers of embezzlement drifted like smoke. On Tuesday evening, matters reached a head when he confronted Lady Agnes in the drawing-room, his voice rising above the quiet hum of the servants' activity. Miss Marple, who happened to be paying a social call upon Lady Agnes's housekeeper at that very moment, heard every word as she stood in the corridor beyond. "You cannot leave me to shoulder this alone," Trent declared, his usually smooth tone broken by strain. "It was you who insisted upon employing him. You vouched for him." Lady Agnes's reply was sharp and cold. "I employed him, yes, and I had my reasons. But you, Lionel, assured me no one would question. If you cannot manage this small inconvenience small—" Trent cut across bitterly. "A man vanishes in broad daylight, and you call it small. The village suspects me, the police hound me, and you speak of inconveniences. If truth comes out, then none of us will be safe." Lady Agnes finished with icy finality. The sound of a door slamming followed, and Lionel's hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. Miss Marple, retreating quietly into the housekeeper's parlor, sat demurely with her hands folded, but her mind was alive with thought. There it was again, truth, concealment, and a strange insistence that the footman's presence had been more than mere employment. But what truth, and why such fear? These were the questions to be unraveled. The villagers, emboldened by gossip, began to air their grievances more openly. Mrs. Ellery, long resentful of Lady Agnes's imperious ways, remarked in the hearing of half the Women's Institute that the Harrodens have always thought themselves above reproach. But mark my words, they're no cleaner than the rest of us. Such statements would once have been dismissed as envy, but in the present climate they carried weight. The servants, too, grew restless. The gardener, emboldened after several pints at the inn, confessed to having seen Charles slip a folded paper into the hand of a young maid in the lane. The maid in question, when pressed, denied it hotly, but her flushed cheeks betrayed that something had passed between them. The story spread until half the village suspected illicit romance. The other half whispered blackmail once more. Inspector Graves, upon hearing these new accounts, concluded firmly that Lionel Trent was hiding some dark financial secret. "It will come out in the books," he told his sergeant confidently. "Mark me, the boy found something in Trent's papers, and Trent silenced him before he could tell. Yet no body had been discovered, no proof unearthed, only shadows, which the inspector mistook for substance. Miss Marple, for her part, quietly pursued smaller threads. She spoke to the vicar, who confessed uneasily that Lionel Trent had sought counsel late one evening. He seemed desperate, the Reverend admitted. Not guilty, Jane, but rather afraid. He begged me for prayers, though he would not say why. I confess, I thought at first it was a matter of drink or money, but now the vicar shook his head. Now I am less certain. Another clue arose from an unexpected quarter. Mr. Prowse, the grocer, recalled that Charles had once asked for directions to the old mill road. Strange request, Prowse told Miss Marple. Servants don't have time for wandering lanes. And when I told him the way, he looked as if I'd given him a secret. The mill road, overgrown and seldom used, led toward the river and the boundary of the Harrowden estate. Few went there to save children playing at adventure. What business would a footman have with such a path? Miss Marple considered this deeply. She had often observed that people in disguise, whether literal or social, sought out lonely places. To meet an accomplice, perhaps, or to conceal something. The mill road joined neatly with the image forming in her mind a young man ill at ease in his borrowed livery, a letter written in haste, and now a path leading out of the village's watchful eyes, as if to sharpen matters. Further, another confrontation occurred. On Friday evening, Lionel Trent, cornered by two local men outside the inn, declared hotly that Lady Agnes was not the victim she pretended to be. She knew him before he came, he said bitterly, his voice carrying down the street. She knew him well, and if she says otherwise, she lies. The words caused an uproar, repeated and embroidered until by morning it was accepted that Lady Agnes had some secret bond with Charles. What kind of bond remained the subject of fierce debate. Some whispered he was her illegitimate son, others a lover disguised as a servant, still others a blackmailer who had ensnared her. Lady Agnes, when confronted with the gossip by her housekeeper, flew into a rage, forbidding her staff to speak further of Charles. Yet her very vehemence only stoked suspicion. And Miss Marple, listening to the ripples spreading outward, thought of her simple rule. When people go to extraordinary lengths to silence a subject, it is often because they know the truth lies too close for comfort. That weekend, Miss Marple took a quiet walk along the mill road. The hedges pressed close, and the path twisted in shadow. Near the river bend, her sharp eyes noticed something half buried in the soil. A small scrap of fabric, coarse and dark, torn at the edge. She stooped, brushed away the dirt, and slipped it into her bag without a word. Another tiny clue, unnoticed by all but her. Returning home, she placed the fabric beside the brass button and the envelope. 3 trifles, seemingly unconnected, but together they whispered a story. She did not yet see its full shape, but she felt it was coming nearer, like the slow turn of a tide. Human passions were stirring in Little Bramble. Secrets pressed too long beneath the surface. Confrontations had begun, and with them, the unravelling. That evening, as she knitted by the fire, Miss Marple reflected on the danger of secrets. They did not remain buried. They grew restless and surfaced when least expected. And she sensed, with that uncanny instinct of hers, that the next revelation would not be a whisper or a quarrel, but something more tangible. Something that would shift the village from speculation to dread. The vanishing of the footman had begun as an oddity, but it was about to darken. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and looked thoughtfully into the flames. People, she murmured softly, are much the same as they ever were. Pride, fear, and folly, one always finds them where trouble lies. Sunday morning brought with it a curious stillness, as though the village itself held its breath. The week of gossip, quarrels, and whispered suspicions had left Little Bramble restless, like a kettle on the verge of boiling over. It was at such moments, Miss Marple often reflected, that events tended to take an unexpected turn, and indeed, that very day, a twist arrived, one that deepened the mystery of the vanished footman and unsettled the village to its roots. It began with the Mill Road. 2 boys, out in search of tadpoles near the river, returned breathless with the tale that they had stumbled upon something queer beneath the old bridge. Their vague description cloth tangled in weeds. A glimmer of metal brought Inspector Graves and his men at once. Before long, half the village had gathered at a cautious distance, murmuring anxiously as the constables waded into the shallows. What they pulled from the water was not a body, as some feared, but a bundle of clothing weighted with stones. Sopping wet and mud-streaked, it was nonetheless recognizable as the livery of a footman, jacket, trousers, waistcoat. Missing, however, were the shoes, and half the buttons had been wrenched away. The discovery electrified the crowd. To many, it was proof that Charles had met with foul play. To others, it suggested escape, a deliberate casting off of identity. Either way, the mystery had grown darker. Inspector Graves, surveying the sodden garments, declared with satisfaction that it confirmed his suspicions. Someone meant to rid themselves of the boy's uniform. If Trent feared exposure, this would be the way of it. Dispose of the livery, silence the lad neatly done. His sergeant nodded, though uneasily. Yet even as the inspector spoke, Miss Marple's eyes rested on the garments with quiet intensity. She noted the torn seams, the hasty stitching along the hem, the uneven length of the trousers. It was exactly as she had thought, a costume ill-suited to its wearer, cobbled together for appearance rather than service. Her theory of impersonation strengthened, though she kept it to herself. The village buzzed with speculation. At the tea shop, Mrs. Larkin insisted it was clear proof of murder. No man casts off his livery unless he no longer needs it, and why should he not need it unless he is dead? Mr. Chalmers countered that Charles had clearly run away, shedding the trappings of servitude like a snake its skin. Mrs. Ellery, ever eager to outdo her neighbors, suggested with relish that the clothes were planted, meant to deceive. "And mark me," she added darkly, "Lady Agnes knows more than she said." That evening, Lady Agnes did little to allay suspicions. She summoned Inspector Graves to the manor house and demanded in a tone of imperious command that he put an end to the nonsense. "You are disturbing the household with endless questions," she said sharply. "I will not have my name dragged through the mud over a servant who clearly abandoned his post." Yet even as she spoke, her eyes flickered toward the fireplace where the flames licked hungrily. And Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively nearby, wondered whether Lady Agnes had already consigned certain incriminating papers to the fire. But the twist did not end with the livery. On Monday morning, the vicar's gardener, digging near the edge of the churchyard to plant roses, struck something hard in the soil. At first he thought it a stone. Closer inspection revealed it to be a small tin box, rusted but intact, wedged deep beneath the roots. Word spread at once, and by afternoon Inspector Graves arrived to prise it open under the watchful gaze of half the village. Inside were paper letters, yellowed and creased, written in the same bold hand as the threatening note found near the stables. They spoke of debts, of promises unkept, of someone who had fled disgrace once and would not be allowed to flee again. Though no names were given, the tone was unmistakably coercive. To Graves, it was more proof of blackmail. To Miss Marple, it was confirmation that the matter reached far deeper than the inspector realized. The villagers seized upon the discovery with feverish delight. Theories abounded. Some said Charles himself had hidden the box, fearing exposure. Others believed Lionel Trent had planted it to deflect suspicion from himself. A few, more daring, whispered that Lady Agnes was the true target, that her past, whatever it might be, was catching up to her at last. The quiet lanes of Little Bramble had never been so alive with intrigue. Yet beneath the noise, a more sinister air crept in. On Tuesday evening, a scream shattered the calm. It came from the maid who had once found the tray of glasses in the stables. She had been sent to the cellar for preserves and returned pale and trembling, declaring that she had seen a man's shadow moving among the barrels. Constables searched the space thoroughly but found nothing. Still, the incident fanned the flames of fear. If Charles was alive, had he returned in secret? Or was someone else haunting the manor's darkened halls? Miss Marple, visiting the house the following day under the pretext of returning a borrowed volume, listened with care to the servants' frightened chatter. She asked nothing directly, but her mild inquiries drew forth details. The maid had noticed the shadow carried a hat, something Charles had never worn. The butler's replacement, a stoic man named Hawkins, admitted grudgingly that the wine-cellar door had been left unlocked that night, though it was usually secured. Small details, perhaps, but to Miss Marple they suggested not a ghostly return, but a calculated intrusion. She walked home slowly through the twilight, her parasol tapping the cobbles, her mind weaving threads together. The discarded livery, the hidden letters, the frightened servants all pointed toward a story of concealment and pressure, of someone cornered and someone else desperate to keep silent. And now another twist. An intruder moving unseen, seeking perhaps to recover what had been hidden. At her cottage, Miss Marple laid the new scrap of fabric she had found on the mill road beside the brass button, and the damp letters borrowed briefly under the guise of tidying. The pieces multiplied, each small in itself, but together forming the shape of a puzzle. And though Inspector Graves grew ever more convinced of Lionel Trent's guilt, Miss Marple knew the true danger lay elsewhere. She sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily, and murmured softly to herself, "When one pulls a thread, the whole garment begins to unravel. And I fancy this garment is about to come apart entirely." For she sensed, with that instinct honed over years of village life, that the next revelation would not merely shock, it would strike at the heart of Little Bramble's most carefully guarded secrets. The discovery of the sodden livery and the hidden tin box had thrown Little Bramble into a ferment that showed no signs of settling. The villagers, eager for a culprit, shifted their suspicions almost daily, sometimes upon Lionel Trent, sometimes upon Lady Agnes, and occasionally upon the vanished Charles himself, who in certain accounts had become both victim and villain. Yet for all the excitement, no real progress was made. Inspector Graves grew more frustrated with every passing day, muttering about unreliable witnesses and elusive evidence. Miss Marple, however, remained serenely patient, for she knew that truth could seldom be forced. It had to be coaxed like a wary bird to the hand. Still, there came a moment when coaxing was no longer enough, when the truth had to be tested. And Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with her knitting, decided that the time for such a test had arrived. Her plan was characteristically simple. She would say nothing openly, ask no direct questions, but instead present a fragment of the truth to one of the key figures in the affair and observe the reaction. For Miss Marple understood, better than most, that people betrayed themselves most clearly, not in their words but in their unguarded moments, the flicker of the eyes, the sudden intake of breath, the nervous hand upon a chair. A psychological game, yes, but one played with the gentlest of moves. She chose her moment carefully. On Wednesday afternoon she accepted an invitation to tea at the manor house. Lady Agnes, though outwardly composed, received her with a strained smile, her movements clipped and precise. Lionel Trent was also present, seated stiffly with a sheaf of papers beside him, as though to remind himself of his professional dignity. The conversation began innocuous weather, the vicar's sermon, the progress of the roses, but Miss Marple steered it, gently and almost imperceptibly, toward the matter of the fete. "I was reminded," she said mildly, stirring her tea, "of a young man I once knew, years ago in St. Mary Mead. He wore a uniform that was not his own, and it was the smallest of things, a button missing, that gave him away. Such trifles are curious, are they not? One notices them when one looks closely. The silence that followed was telling." Lady Agnes's spoon clattered faintly against her cup, and she hastily set it down. Lionel Trent's face tightened, his eyes flickering to Lady Agnes before returning to his papers. Neither spoke. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger, her expression one of vague reminiscence, before turning the talk to chrysanthemums as though nothing had passed. But she had seen enough. Reactions spoke louder than denials. The following day, she played her second move. Calling at Lionel Trent's office under the pretext of needing advice on a fictitious investment scheme recommended by a distant cousin, she drew him into polite conversation. After listening with apparent confusion, she leaned closer and remarked in her gentle, conspiratorial way, "Of course, one must always be cautious. I dare say you would know, Mr. Trent, that when a young man pretends to be what he is not, he is often discovered in the end. The truth always has a way of surfacing." Trent, who had been leaning back wearily in his chair, started so violently that his pen fell to the floor. His hands trembled as he stooped to retrieve it. What do you mean, Miss Marple?" he stammered, his voice hoarse. "Oh, nothing at all," she said sweetly. "Only that human nature is very much the same, whether in Little Bramble or St. Mary Mead. One learns to recognize patterns." She left him then, his face pale and drawn, her point made. If he was not directly guilty, he was entangled in the web, and her words had tugged at a thread he would not easily ignore. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves blundered on, preparing once more to bring charges against Lionel Trent, despite the lack of concrete evidence. "He knows something," Graves told his sergeant doggedly. "You mark my words, he'll break if we press hard enough." Yet Miss Marple knew that pressing was the surest way to drive a man into silence. Better to let him betray himself by accident. Her third test was reserved for Lady Agnes. Attending a luncheon at the vicarage where Lady Agnes was present, Miss Marple waited until conversation turned, as it inevitably did, to the vanished footman. "It is strange," Miss Marple mused, as though thinking aloud, how often young men receive letters when they ought not to. "Why, the postmistress mentioned to me a curious example just before the fete. A letter, bold handwriting, addressed to the manor. One wonders what became of it." Lady Agnes's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against the china. She recovered herself swiftly, but colour had risen to her cheeks, and her eyes darted briefly toward Miss Marple with something very like alarm. "Idle gossip," she said sharply. "You must not listen to such things." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Miss Marple smiled, her expression benign, and changed the subject to summer preserves. By the end of the week, Miss Marple had gathered more from reactions than Inspector Graves had from all his interrogations. The vanishing footman was no mere servant who had deserted his post. He was bound up with Lady Agnes's past, entangled in Lionel Trent's unease, and pursued by a shadow of blackmail and threat. The discarded livery and the hidden letters pointed to a man playing a role that was never his to begin with. The question remained, what role, and why? Her final test came almost by chance. She encountered Hawkins, the new butler in the lane as she returned from the grocer. He was a taciturn man, little given to speech, but Miss Marple stopped him with a kind inquiry after his duties. As he shifted awkwardly, she remarked, "It must be difficult to step into another's shoes, especially when they have been so suddenly vacated. Why, one might almost imagine they had been cast off, like an ill-fitting coat." Hawkins paled, his lips pressing together in a hard line. Without a word, he tipped his hat and hurried on, leaving Miss Marple standing in the lane with a faint smile. Another reaction, another confirmation. The vanishing footman had not merely run away. His disappearance was part of a larger game, one that touched every corner of the Harrowden household. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour, her knitting needles clicking with steady rhythm. Before her on the table lay the brass button, the scrap of fabric, and the borrowed letter from the tin box. Each was small, insignificant in isolation, but together they whispered of a truth not yet spoken aloud. The tests had done their work. Fear had shown itself in Lady Agnes's slip, in Trent's trembling, in Hawkins's silence. All that remained was to draw the threads together and wait for the right moment to reveal what she already knew in her heart. For Miss Marple, the mystery was no longer one of disappearance, but of identity, of past sins reaching into the present. And she knew, with that quiet certainty that had guided her through many such puzzles, that the next turn would be decisive. Another revelation was coming, and when it did, the whole of Little Bramble would feel the weight of truth. The air in Little Bramble grew taut in the days following Miss Marple's quiet tests. The gossip, once lively and free, now carried an undertone of dread. People whispered less openly, glancing over their shoulders as though fearing unseen airs. Something was coming, that much the village felt, though none could have said precisely what. Miss Marple, however, knew. She had been watching, collecting, and now the time had come to draw the curtain back. The opportunity arose at the vicarage. Reverend Green, troubled by the unrest in his parish, invited Lady Agnes, Lionel Trent, Inspector Graves, and a few others to tea in the hope of easing tensions. Miss Marple was also included naturally, for her presence lent an air of calm to gatherings, though those who knew her well recognized that her calmness often preceded revelations. The room was genteel, the tea hot, the cucumber sandwiches cut precisely, but beneath the surface lay an atmosphere as strained as a taut string. The conversation began politely enough, yet inevitably turned to the subject of the vanished footman. Inspector Graves, frowning over his cup, declared once more that Lionel Trent remained the chief suspect. "The evidence mounts, however circumstantial," he said heavily. "And until the man confesses or the body is found, we cannot proceed otherwise." Trent's face reddened. "I have nothing to confess. This endless persecution is intolerable." He turned to Lady Agnes, his voice breaking. "You know I'm innocent. You know more than you admit." Lady Agnes stiffened, her knuckles white against her teacup. "I will not be drawn into baseless speculation," she said coldly. But her eyes flickered toward Miss Marple, who sat serenely knitting as though the storm around her did not exist. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. "It is curious," she said in her gentle voice, "how often we look for guilt in the wrong direction. We think of what seems most obvious, when in fact it is the small things, the trifles, that tell the truth. For instance, a button lying in the lane, a piece of cloth on the mill road, a letter received by a servant too new to have correspondence. These are not dramatic pieces of evidence, yet they speak clearly if one listens." All eyes turned to her. Inspector Graves frowned impatiently. "With respect, Miss Marple, trifles do not make a case. We require facts." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "And these trifles are facts. Facts that reveal our footman, Charles, was never truly a servant at all. His livery did not fit his shoes and the stitching was poor. It was a costume, hurriedly prepared, not the garb of a man who had long served in a great house. And when his garments were found in the river, They bore out this truth. They were not cast off in escape, but discarded after their purpose had been served. A hush fell. Lady Agnes shifted in her chair, her composure trembling at the edges. "You suggest what, precisely?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I suggest that Charles came to the manor not as a servant, but as an intruder wearing the mask of one. He had a connection to this household, a connection strong enough to warrant such deception. He carried letters, bold in hand, threatening exposure. He sought, perhaps, to claim something he believed was his by right." Lionel Trent leaned forward, his eyes wide. "You mean yes," Miss Marple said gently. Charles was not merely a stranger. He was Lady Agnes's son. The words struck like a blow. Lady Agnes gasped, her hand flying to her throat. The others stared in stunned silence. Only Miss Marple's calm voice continued, measured and certain. "Years ago, before her marriage, Lady Agnes bore a child in secret. The matter was hushed, arrangements made, the child placed out of sight. Such things happened, though seldom spoken of. Yet the past has a way of returning. Charles came back not as a petitioner, but as a threat. His letters reveal as much. He meant to expose the truth, to demand recognition or wealth. And so he donned the livery, placed himself in her household, and waited for his moment. Inspector Graves blustered. But then, if he was her son, what became of him? Why should he vanish? Miss Marple's eyes rested on Lady Agnes. Because Lady Agnes could not allow her secret to be known. At the fete, when Charles slipped toward the stables, there was a meeting. Words were spoken harshly. I imagine Charles pressed his demands too boldly. Lady Agnes acted in desperation. The livery was stripped away, discarded in the river. The footman vanished as he must, for his very existence endangered her standing. And Lionel Trent, she glanced at the solicitor, was drawn into the concealment, unwillingly, for he had managed her affairs all these years and knew too much to escape. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock. Lady Agnes's face had gone ashen. Her lips trembled, but no denial came. Lionel Trent covered his eyes with his hand. At last, Lady Agnes spoke, her voice a whisper. "You clever, meddling woman. You have no proof." "No." Miss Marple's tone was still gentle. "The proof lies in the very things you overlooked. The button I found in the lane, torn from livery in haste. The scrap of fabric near the mill road where Charles likely struggled. The letters hidden in the churchyard, buried in fear. And, most telling of all, the reactions your own, Mr. Trent's, even Hawkins's unease. Truth reveals itself in the smallest cracks, Lady Agnes, and once seen, it cannot be unseen." Inspector Graves rose heavily, his expression grim. "Lady Agnes Harrowden, I must ask you to accompany me." But she did not move. She sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the fire, her voice low and unsteady. "He was my son," she whispered. "My shame. He came back to destroy me, to drag it all into the light. I could not bear it. Better for him to disappear, better for the world to believe he had fled." No one spoke. The confession hung in the air, terrible in its quietness. Miss Marple's knitting lay still upon her lap, her face serene yet touched with sadness. She had solved the puzzle, but as always, the solution was no triumph. Human folly, human pride, human fear, these were the roots of tragedy, and they grew in every soil. The gathering broke in heavy silence. Lady Agnes was led away, Lionel Trent close behind, his shoulders bowed. Inspector Graves muttered of formalities and statements. The vicar prayed softly under his breath. And Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, her expression composed. She had seen it all before, the way secrets, hidden for years, burst forth at last, and the ruin they left behind. For all her gentle manner, she knew too well the sharp edges of human nature. Outside, the village lay quiet in the twilight. Curtains twitched as people peered from windows, sensing that the great house upon the hill had yielded its secrets at last. And Miss Marple, walking slowly homeward, thought with a sigh of the cost of pride and concealment. She knew the village would talk of this affair for years to come, embroidering details until truth and tale became one. Yet the heart of it would remain unchanged, a young man seeking recognition, a mother desperate to preserve her place, and a crime born of fear. The firelight glowed warmly as she entered her cottage. She set aside her knitting, placed the brass button and fabric scrap in a drawer, and sat quietly for a time. The mystery was solved, the truth revealed, but there was no satisfaction in it. Only a quiet melancholy. For in every case she had ever touched, Miss Marple knew, the greatest mystery was not in the crime itself, but in the frailty of the human heart. The morning after Lady Agnes's confession dawned grey and unsettled, with a fine drizzle misting over the hedgerows and cobblestones of Little Bramble. The village awoke slowly, and in every home the first words exchanged were not of the weather or the day's errands, but of the shocking scene at the vicarage. By now the tale had flown across the lanes and fields. Lady Agnes Harrowden had admitted that the vanished footman was her son, hidden away in the shadows of her past. Whether she had killed him outright or simply arranged his disappearance, the villagers were not yet certain. But the scandal itself was enough to set tongues wagging. At the tea shop, Mrs. Larkin declared with grim satisfaction that she had always suspected something. "You cannot build a life on secrets," she told her companions, her voice ringing with moral certainty. "Sooner or later they fester, and see what has come of it now." Mrs. Ellery, less restrained, hinted darkly that the Harrowden fortune was bound to collapse, and wondered aloud what would become of the estate. The women clucked and shook their heads, half horrified, half delighted, as gossip often is. The men at the inn were equally divided. Some muttered that Lady Agnes had acted out of desperation, and one or two suggested that the young man himself bore blame for blackmailing his mother. Others, sterner, insisted that murder, if murder it was, could never be excused. "Blue blood or no," Mr. Chalmers said stoutly, "a crime's a crime." The innkeeper, polishing his glasses with unnecessary vigor, remarked that it would be years before Little Bramble lived down the shame. At the manor house, silence reigned. Lady Agnes had been taken under discreet guard to the county jail, her proud figure diminished now, wrapped in a dark cloak against the stares of villagers as she departed. Lionel Trent, pale and weary, had given his formal statement, confirming what little he knew of her desperate act. He was released, but his reputation lay in tatters. Those who had once trusted him with their affairs now whispered of his complicity, and though no crime was laid at his door, the taint of scandal clung to him like a shadow. Inspector Graves, though outwardly satisfied with the resolution, carried himself with less triumph than one might have expected. He had been so intent on Lionel Trent that Lady Agnes's guilt had caught him by surprise. More than once in the following days, he muttered to his sergeant about meddling spinsters who seemed to know more than the constabulary itself. Yet inwardly, even Graves could not deny that without Miss Marple's quiet observations, the truth might never have surfaced. Miss Marple, for her part, bore no airs of triumph. She moved about the village as she always had, calling on Mrs. Bantry, inquiring after Mrs. Larkin's rheumatism, purchasing her weekly supply of wool at the haberdashery. Yet wherever she went, people looked at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity, as though she carried with her some uncanny sight. She deflected their questions with modesty. "Oh, I merely noticed what anyone might have done," she said gently. But the villagers knew better. They sensed that her knitting needles and mild inquiries hid a mind sharper than most. In her own cottage, Miss Marple reflected quietly on the affair. The brass button lay in the drawer where she had placed it, alongside the scrap of cloth and the damp envelope. These trifles had led her to the truth, yet they were tokens only of the larger tragedy. A mother's pride, a son's resentment, a secret buried too long, all had converged in a desperate act. It was not wickedness alone, she thought, but fear, that most human of weaknesses, which had driven Lady Agnes. Fear of disgrace, fear of exposure, fear of losing the fragile scaffolding of respectability upon which her life was built. She remembered other cases, other villages, where fear had played its part. A wife who stole quietly from her husband rather than confess her debts, a young girl who lied to conceal a love affair, an old man who hoarded letters lest the truth of his past be known. Always fear, and always it led not to safety, but to ruin. On the second evening after the confession, Reverend Green called upon Miss Marple to thank her for her presence at the vicarage. "It was a terrible moment, Jane," he admitted, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Yet perhaps a necessary one. Better that the truth come out than that we all live with whispers and shadows." He paused, then added more softly, "And better that it be revealed by your gentle hand than by harsh interrogation." Miss Marple shook her head. "Truth, Reverend, has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully it is hidden. I did little more than notice what others overlooked." She gave a faint smile. "The smallest things, you see. They are always the most telling." The Reverend sighed. "And what of Charles? Will they ever find him?" Miss Marple's eyes grew distant. "Perhaps. Perhaps not. The river and the fields keep their secrets well. But whether his body is found or not, the truth of what happened will remain. And that, I fear, is punishment enough for Lady Agnes." In the days that followed, Little Bramble began slowly to resume its routine. Children returned to their games on the green, the band practiced for the harvest festival, and shopkeepers once again called cheerful greetings to their customers. Yet an undercurrent of unease lingered, a sense that their tranquil village was not so untouched by sin as they had once believed. Curtains still twitched when footsteps passed after dark, and gossip still circled like sparrows around the manor's empty windows. For Miss Marple, the affair left no bitterness, only a quiet melancholy. She knew too well that human beings, in all their frailty, repeated the same mistakes generation after generation. Pride, folly, jealousy, fear. These were constants of human nature, as certain as the changing of the seasons. And though each case was clothed in its own particulars, the pattern was always the same. One evening, as she sat by her fire, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, Mrs. Bantry called in for a visit. She was full of the latest gossip, of course, and declared that she had never known such excitement in the village. "Why, Jane, they'll be speaking of this for decades. I do wonder, though, do you never tire of such grim matters? To see through them as you do, and so calmly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One cannot tire of human nature, Dolly. It is endlessly varied, yet always the same. One sees the same dramas played out in small ways at teas and fetes as one does in larger tragedies. People do not change, you know, only the details." Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. "I should be frightened, were it not for you. There's comfort in knowing someone can see clearly when the rest of us are lost in gossip." But Miss Marple only folded her hands and looked into the fire. She did not seek comfort, nor did she glory in her discoveries. She saw the truth for what it was, simple, tragic, inevitable. And in that quiet seeing, she found not triumph, but a measure of peace. Outside, the rain ceased, and the village lay hushed under the silver light of the moon. Life would go on, as it always did, but with a faint shadow upon it, now a reminder that even in the most peaceful of places, darkness could take root, and Miss Marple, ever composed, ever observant, sat alone in her little parlour, reflecting on the fragile line between respectability and ruin. The affair of the Vanishing Footman was over, but its lesson lingered that truth, however deeply buried, will always find its way into the light. Summer waned gently in Little Bramble. the hedgerows heavy with berries and the evenings growing cool. The village, as villages do, slipped back into its rhythms, though the affair of the Vanishing Footman left an imprint none could entirely forget. In the tea shop, the tale was repeated in whispers to curious visitors, and at the inn, men still shook their heads gravely when the manor house was mentioned. Scandal, after all, never vanished. It simply folded itself into the fabric of local memory, embroidered a little more with each retelling. The manor itself stood strangely silent. With Lady Agnes removed to the county prison, the shutters were drawn more often than not, and weeds began to creep at the edges of the immaculate gravel paths. Servants drifted away to other posts, unwilling to remain in a house tainted by tragedy. Lionel Trent, his reputation, in tatters, packed up his office and departed for London under cover of dusk, leaving behind only a locked door and unanswered questions. The estate solicitor's brass plaque was taken down within a fortnight, and the square seemed emptier for it. Yet life in Little Bramble continued, as it must. Children still played by the green, the Women's Institute still argued over sponge recipes, and the vicar still preached his gentle sermons. Only in quieter moments did people pause, glancing toward the manor and murmuring secrets too dark to be spoken plainly. It was as though the whole village had learned that beneath the gloss of respectability, shadows might lurk shadows closer than anyone cared to admit. Miss Marple, ever composed, returned to her quiet life. She tended her garden, exchanged gossip with Mrs. Bantry, and knitted steadily by her fire. Yet those who knew her well noticed a certain pensiveness about her in the weeks after the case. She spoke less, and when she did, her words carried an undertone of reflection, for she had long understood that the greatest mysteries were not those of missing footmen or hidden letters, but of the human heart itself. One afternoon, as she sat with Mrs. Bantry in the little parlor fragrant with lavender, her friend ventured the question that many had thought, but few dared ask. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said softly, "do you ever grow weary of it all, of seeing what others cannot? It must be a heavy thing to understand so clearly the darkness in people." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles resting in her lap. "Not weary, Dolly. One cannot grow weary of human nature. It is what it is, flawed, frail, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind. What I see is no more than what has always been pride, fear, jealousy, and love. They repeat themselves endlessly, dressed in different clothes, but at heart unchanged. To notice them is not a burden. It is simply life." Mrs. Bantry shivered a little, then laughed to cover it. "You make it sound inevitable." "It is inevitable," Miss Marple said gently, "but knowing does not mean despairing. One must also see the good, the loyalty, the kindness, the small mercies. They are there, even if they are quieter than the scandals. And sometimes, Dolly, it is enough." Outside, the bells of the church rang for evensong, their sound drifting across the green. The villagers gathered, as they always had, to pray, to gossip, to share in the ordinary rituals of community. The scandal of the Vanishing Footman would fade into story, then into legend, and eventually into the kind of tale told with lowered voices by the fireside. But its lesson would linger, at least in the heart of one elderly spinster who had seen it all before and would, no doubt, see it all again. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone by her window, the twilight painting the village in soft hues of gold and violet. She watched the children dart across the green, the lamps being lit in the cottages, the slow rhythm of life resuming its course. To anyone passing by, she was no more than a kindly old lady at her knitting, but behind her quiet eyes lay the weight of human frailty, understood and accepted without illusion. The affair of the Vanishing Footman was over. The scandal would die down, the manor would crumble or revive in time, and Little Bramble would continue, as English villages always did. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath its tranquil surface, as beneath every surface, lay the same eternal story of folly and fear, pride and passion. And she, sitting quietly with her needles and her thoughts, would be there to see a unassuming sentinel, watching, waiting, and, when the time came, quietly unravelling the truth once more.